is an incredible thing, as you've been learning throughout the day. There's so many different angles to it. Everyone has a different lens. And all these people are incentivized to add to the network in some way, to build it, to improve it. And that's really what I want to highlight here. There's been a lot of conversation about education today, and education is incredibly important, but so is good product, good tools. How do we actually get people using this thing? And hopefully after this conversation today, you'll see there's some really incredible things going on. So, JP, thank you for the introductions. Andi, I'm going to come to you first. If you could give a small intro as to what you're working on at the moment predominantly, and what are you building on Bitcoin?
So I give it up to these guys for doing a lot of the building. I support companies that are building. So we invest in companies that are building in the Bitcoin ecosystem, a lot of which are kind of involved in Lightning. We've invested in Fedi. So anyone that's really building technology for people to use Bitcoin in any way. A couple of things. We're very excited. A lot of Lightning infrastructure. Fedi, I love. It's incredible what they're building. I'm also really excited about Nostr right now, which is this new decentralized social media, or really a decentralized protocol for information that is really going to transform the world. So that's kind of some of the things I'm excited about right now.
Awesome. And Rusty, just to pass that to you then. So a very quick introduction as to what you're working on and what you're building on Bitcoin.
Cool. So Blockstream was founded by Bitcoin core developers because there wasn't enough investment in Bitcoin itself at the time. So we do all kinds of Bitcoin things, but particularly my team work on core Lightning and the Lightning spec, which is basically the interoperability between all the Lightning implementations and how we work together. So that's my day job, and that's pretty much been my life for the last 7 years.
Awesome, and we'll dive into more detail on what you guys are specifically doing as well. So Pete, just to finally yourself, a very brief intro as to what you're working on and what you're building on Bitcoin.
Okay, hi, my name's Pete. I work at Fedi. We work largely on the Fedi Mint protocol, so it's a lot of people like to call it a layer 3. I think it's probably a layer 2, if I'm honest. We do like sort of federated applications on top of Bitcoin. So if you've ever wanted your Bitcoin to do a little bit more, you've wanted like a little bit of smart contracts, or you wanted a little bit more privacy, like that's the sort of thing you get when you move some of your Bitcoin into the Fedi Mint sort of ecosystem. So it'll be apps and contracts and all sorts of things on top of that. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. It's so interesting to think, I was born in 1988, so the 90s I was still a young boy, but the dot-com boom was real, and I read all these stories about entrepreneurs building on the internet and these incredible stories, and it feels somehow like Bitcoin's kind of my version of that in some ways, as a more mature person who's willing to help build products, finance companies, get involved with people. So how does that kind of really play to you guys? And this seems to be a big moment that is happening right now. And so, yes, I mentioned already this idea of education versus product. So I'll ask you guys the same question. We'll just go through it. So do you believe, Andi, that education is more important than product, or which way around do you see it?
I think they're both very important. Obviously, what we're focused on is use cases and people actually using them and what that looks like as a way to actually bring people into the network. I think getting people into Bitcoin through education is really, really important. Does that scale to mass adoption? That I'm not sure about. So a lot of us in the room have probably spent a very significant amount of time
just a little bit
listening to podcasts, reading books to understand it, and I'm not sure that that's scalable to 1 billion people. And so to me, building products that solve a use case, that solve a problem for people that they just use because it works, they don't have to spend 100 hours listening to something, they just have a technology and it works. The same way I use email, I have no idea how email works, to be quite frank. You're probably horrified at that, but that's kind of the truth. Or my car, I have a rough idea, right? I have a rough idea how email works, but it just works, and it does something for me that I want it to do, and that's how I think you get billions of people onboarded onto Bitcoin, is when something just works, and it just works for them.
Awesome, and so I'll come to you guys. Yeah, it's cool, isn't it? Andi obviously taking equity positions in early stage companies that are building on use cases. So exactly, but it's very cool to then try and understand what those use cases are. But so I'm going to pass the question along, Rusty, this kind of education versus product thing, and if you could also just explain a use case that you're particularly passionate about, that would be great.
So I'm not smart enough to I'm a hands-on kind of person, right? I have to play with something. So can't separate the two. I can't have education just raw by itself. There's got to be something to play with. Otherwise, it's not engaging. I'm going to go do something else. So I don't think you can separate the two. I don't think you can have education without an actual product there, or something to touch. But the important thing is that the people who build the product, I like them to know more about it than I do. So they're leading me onto this path of like, you could also do this, right? So it's an enabler, right? And that only happens if they've got the education. So it's important you get this core group of people who really get it, and they educate a few more people, and they build stuff, and it kind of goes out in layers. Yeah, sure, on the far remote people, it might get a little bit wonky with the whispers of what they hear, but that's the best you can do. But you've got to do both of them together.
Completely agree. And just before we get to you, Pete, so is there a use case that you can talk us through that's really important from a kind of product perspective that is an everyday problem that gets solved that you can quickly highlight to us?
Wow. Is there one use case? Okay, so I always said that the first use case for Lightning is going to be something that I think is stupid. The same way I thought Twitter was stupid. Okay, it's still kind of stupid, but you get the idea, right? You first hear about it, you go, why? What's that even for, right? Because almost by definition, the things that Lightning are really good at are things that don't exist yet. And so if you had a business idea that required that, your business didn't exist. It couldn't exist. So when you come up with this and you marry these two, I'm going to go, I don't get it, right? And that's okay, because I'm not a product guy. I'm an engineer and no one cares, right? But so I'm not going to try to project forward and go, hey, there's some use case out there. I know it exists, but by definition, it can't exist yet. Now we've got Lightning, it can exist. And someone is going to come up with it. And in retrospect, it'll be obvious, but I promise your first reaction is, I don't get it. And maybe it's Nostra, like this whole zapping thing is like crack for people on Nostra, I know. So maybe that's it, I don't know.
Awesome. And Pete, to you, so this trade-off, or not trade-off actually, how they work clearly and synonymously as we're going through, but education and product and a use case for a product that you're working on.
So I think, first of all, I'd like to say that this question is clearly a trap and it's very harsh to do that, Jake. I guess the next thing I'd say is, as luck would happen...
It's not supposed to be a trap. It's supposed to be a conversation opener.
If I was Admiral Akbar, my chair would spin round, right? And I'd tell you this is a trap. As it would happen, my title at Fedi is actually the head of product and education.
I didn't know that.
We see the two things as synonymous. Right, there is no education without a product to educate on, and there is no product without educating people about how to use it. So I think the two things need to be held in tension. Like there needs to be education. It's not that one thing is more important than the other. It's not that you could have one without the other. There is no Bitcoin education without Bitcoin. There is no Bitcoin without people understanding about Bitcoin. So I think I'd say the two things need to be held in tension, and you should do both at the same time, and you should be meeting people where they are with the education and the product, quite frankly.
Awesome. And so do you have a use case then that you're specifically working on that you can talk to us about today that helps translate what building on Bitcoin actually means? Like, okay, we came across this and what we're going to have a crack at.
I was looking at Rusty a moment ago, and I was just thinking, oh, God, I can't believe he just got called on a use case, and he had to think that. And I can't believe that I didn't, at that point in time, think of a use case to answer this.
Well, it's okay. We can come back to it. It's all right.
That's the exact question. All right, let's think about this. I mean, it can be as simple as anything else, right? Like it's like everything you do with Bitcoin is kind of novel in a way. So I think like the ability to store Bitcoin long time. I think the ability to send and receive Bitcoin. Like I always find the moment when you onboard somebody to Bitcoin and you actually remember to give them Bitcoin. Like we often talk in a lot of theoretical concepts in Bitcoin, but like when you just say, oh, just get this Lightning wallet, and then you just give somebody like $5, and they just go, what? I've just got this, and like nobody else stood in the way, and you just gave this from your phone to my phone, and they have that moment of receiving stuff. Like I think like that sort of use case is good. So I think quickly getting people to that point where they're owning something and they understand what it means that nobody else stood in between the two of you at that moment is
I think you're being very humble because you're not talking about what you're working on, which is like the ultimate use case.
Now you're being really called out. Come on, Pete. What's Fedi doing?
Do you want me to talk about it?
No,
I'll talk about it.
I can talk about it. Like you're all Fedimin fans. That's great. So maybe like another use case would be something like collaborative custody of money. So
How would you do that?
Thank you, Rusty.
I mean, can we federate Lightning nodes yet? Like, if you don't... All right, we'll have a bit back and forth. Well, one of the things that we do in Fedi is like give people the ability to share money amongst a community. So one of the ways I like to explain this is the idea that, let's say you had a community of 100,000 people and you wanted to get them all into Bitcoin. One way you might want to go about that is that you could go and orange pill 100,000 people in that community, and you could give them out 100,000 Raspberry Pis, and they could all run their nodes, and they could all set up like Lightning networks and whatnot. But maybe like a slightly more efficient way to do that would be to choose like the 5 people in that community or the 10 people in that community that really get it, and provide them with a system that allowed them to provide useful financial services to the other 100,000 people. And then those people just get banking, or they just get loans, or they just get whatever it happens to be that they need. And they get invested in Bitcoin that way. Like, they don't actually need to deal with the ins and outs of what it means to hold and own Bitcoin. Like, somebody else in their community can provide that for them. And Fedimint provides like a nice platform on which to build that.
But wouldn't you be concerned those 5 or 10 people would be privy to everyone's financial information?
Wouldn't it be lovely, Rusty, if we took a technology from the 80s, such as blind signatures and Xiaomi and eCash, and we were able to build that sort of system, but in a way that those 5 or 10 people had no idea like what anybody in that system actually had in terms of their accounts, like that they had accounts at all, how much they had in their accounts, or where they were spending their money. That would be marvelous.
Shut up and take my money.
I will provide you a Bitcoin address, and I'll take as much money as you want to give me.
I'm super excited to see what Fedi creates. It's going to be very cool. And just an example of this that I gave to Pete earlier was someone close to me came and asked about Bitcoin recently, and I was trying to teach them about it, and you realize there's just so much content to get through, and it's so much. And this was a lady close to 60, and I was saying, okay, well, you've got to take your money out of the bank, and you've got to put it into this app, and you've got to buy something on an exchange, and you've got to move it to a self-custody. And it's so many steps for someone to try and handle. You're like, okay, maybe it would just be so much easier if you had a friend that you could really trust in your local community that could help you through this process. And I think that would be a really awesome thing to bring to the world. Andy, I'm going to flick this one to you. So we're all interested in Bitcoin. We're all interested in the price gains of Bitcoin. How do you outpace Bitcoin? And as an investor, how do you think about the opportunities you're seeing as an early stage equity buyer?
Yeah, it's a question we get a lot from potential investors, and obviously something we think about a lot. I think there is potential that the ecosystem that we're investing in outpaces Bitcoin. So if we think about Bitcoin being kind of the base layer of technology, and then you have a kind of entire economy ecosystem that's going to be built on top of that, that could end up being kind of multiples times the sort of value of the base layer. It could not. You know, we just don't know. But there is definitely that potential. I think from an investment standpoint, it's also really interesting to think about investing in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So a lot of our investors might have a portfolio, and they have for sure a significant portion in Bitcoin, and then they want to invest in the Bitcoin ecosystem as well. It provides partially decorrelated returns. So it's a way of kind of constructing a portfolio that you get investment, you get exposure to Bitcoin, but in a partially decorrelated way. Because I think the companies we're investing in, like, we don't need the Bitcoin price to go up for those companies to be successful. They're building technology, adoption technology like Fedi. If the price doesn't go up from here, it doesn't really impact how Fedi will be successful or not. So I think that's really, really interesting.
And Rusty and Pete, to head over in your direction, not that you're necessarily capital allocators, but you're working for businesses that have taken in some funding or will look to play in that space. So how do you guys think through that concept of, like, is it necessary to outpace Bitcoin, or how might you do it?
Yeah, no, so I'm an engineer, so I don't care. What else would I be working on?
Great answer.
There's nothing else that's shaking the world up this much. There's nothing else that's this interesting and impactful as Bitcoin, and Lightning particularly for me was the rabbit hole that I had to explore. So you're going to die sometime. What else are you going to do with your time?
Awesome. And Pete, how about yourself? Yeah, sure. No, I was just asking Andi about how she might outpace the price growth of Bitcoin as an early stage investor. And so as someone working in a business that's been funded by Andi, how do you think about that?
I think as Andi said, like, our business doesn't necessarily need the Bitcoin price to go up. The Bitcoin price going up is always useful for people getting interested in Bitcoin. As I said a minute ago, like really our adoption approach isn't about the price going up. It's really about extending useful financial services to people. So there's lots of things about financial services that are very useful. Like, so price stability, future pricing of goods, insurance, like these are all very useful things that aren't available to a lot of people in the world. There are vast amounts of people in the world that don't have access to these things and could be onboarded to them. So I think for us, it's really more about like, well, how do we bring 1 billion people that don't have access to financial services into a world where they do? I think if they do, we will have no money, we'll have no problem making money out of that. If you have a bank with 1 billion customers, you're probably doing all right. So
yeah, awesome.
That would be our approach.
And I can feel as we touch on certain subjects, kind of how exciting Bitcoin is to you guys. So just a very, very broad question, Andi. I'll start just at this end again. What makes you the most excited about Bitcoin?
Oh, so many things. That's a hard question.
It's hard, isn't it? Yeah.
I think it's just the most fascinating thing happening in the world right now. If I think about everything in the world, whether it's technology, whether it's politics, whether it's economics, whether it's the environment, whether it's social aspects, Bitcoin touches all of those things and has this potential to really be this foundational shift for the good across such a huge range of different factors. And I'm a person that thinks very broadly. I have a wide range of different interests. And so for me, the opportunity to kind of be part of something like Bitcoin, which is nothing short of a revolution for the world, is like, what else would I work on, really? I think also what gets me then super excited, like I mentioned Noster, it's sort of creating a new internet, and it's in a way enabled by Bitcoin that, again, is going to completely transform the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with information, the way that Bitcoin is transforming the way we interact with money, the way that we interact with value and how that works in the world. And so I think just, yeah, I don't know if there's anything more to say, but yeah.
No, it's amazing when you start kind of digging into it and finding out like all these crazy things. And just to touch on that point, that these brand new markets that have never existed before, like digitally native money. Stephen on earlier talking about how sport's going to evolve. Like this has never existed before. And sorry, so Rusty, just to pass it to you then. So what really makes you most excited about Bitcoin?
Gosh, wow. When I was joining Blockstream, Adam Back said to me once, "Can't sleep because Bitcoin." And, that kind of sums up a whole feeling of like, just from a technical, geeky perspective, someone who's like followed the whole eCash developments over years, Bitcoin's actually doing it for real, and that's kind of cool. I've been an open source dev professionally for 25 years. Like that means people pay me to give away my code, and that's always fun, but there's also a shifting of social norms, right? When I started doing that, my friends thought it was a little bit, my professional friends thought I was doing something really weird. And honestly, I wasn't sure how long it was going to last. Like, were people going to pay me to give away my code? And 25 years later, they still are. So, but the world's shifted now. That's completely normal in a way that it wasn't then. And Bitcoin feels very much the same. It's a technology that at the moment is a bit weird and uncomfortable and wrestling with assumptions about how money works, right? People are like, well, money is this thing that issued by governments, blah, 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 right? And same way software, if you were a geek, was written by large corporations and published and copyrighted, and that's how it worked, right? That's just how it worked. And we understood all that, and then it changed, and suddenly it wasn't, and now that's normal. The Bitcoin thing feels the same way, right? Like this is a thing that is working despite it, everyone thinking this obviously shouldn't work, right? It's unbacked, and it's just weird, right? I just want to warn you, it's going to stay weird for quite a while. It takes about 25 years for this kind of change to go through. So we're like maybe halfway through. So it's all going to be a bit weird, and that's okay. Eventually the old people will die, and Bitcoin will, will have always been here, and just be part of the furniture like anything else. But for the moment in that transition, it's surely one of the best things as a geek that I can work on. And it's still somewhat malleable. Bitcoin is a thing, but it's still, the devs used to say, like, it's an experiment. It's still an experiment. Okay, maybe it's less of an experiment now. Still got some of those flavors, though, right? And we absolutely, like, the reason I'm working on the Lightning Network is it was something that had to exist. To move Bitcoin forward, we needed to use it for payments. And people will all suddenly, no, it's all about store of value. And like, that's not what I'm working on. I'm working on payments. I'm working on trying to move this stuff fast. And it's been 7 years now. And I still get up at 5:30 in the morning every second Tuesday to go to the spec meetings. And because I'm not a morning person, but because it's cool, right? It's exciting and it's fun. And as long as it keeps being that, there's always so much going on in it that I can't put my finger on one thing that's exciting. It's all exciting.
I love that. And it's awesome, isn't it? You can really, really feel people's enthusiasm come through sometimes, can't you? And just to echo that point about the 25 years, I found it very insightful coming across the Lindy effect as a kind of theory that helps you understand where Bitcoin's at the moment and perhaps why people haven't understood it. Quite like earlier today, the Schelling point was mentioned. These are things that are well worth reading up on if you can. And so, Pete, just to come to you finally, we're walking through the question of what excites you most about Bitcoin?
Yeah, a lot. I really like Bitcoin. I fucking love Bitcoin. Excuse my French.
Awesome. Come on.
And it's a personal answer. Part of that is because I really dislike like corruption and stuff. And so I really love the idea of something that's so hard to change that we just sort of reorganize stuff around that. And I really like the idea of something like money that's so central to everything that we do being so hard to change that nobody gets to corrupt it. And that we all just have to deal with that and get on with it. So I think what really excites me about Bitcoin is the idea that we can actually build that. And the fact that we can build this without asking for anybody's permission. Like, we don't need to do that. We can just go and build what we need. We can build things that are useful, and if they are useful, people will use them. So I guess, like, going back to the education and the product question of earlier, it's really like, if we can really focus on just building the useful things that people need, making them easy, getting them out there and shipping them, then we'll be in a world where nobody will be able to fuck around with the money. Nobody will have undue control over other people, and I think there will be a fantastic world. And this is also why I regularly get up at 5 a.m. to talk to people. So
Awesome.
I feel rusty here.
Pete sent me a couple of podcasts to listen to before we did this panel, and in one of them it really tickled me. He described himself as having become an anarchist in a polo shirt, which is part of the process of becoming a Bitcoiner in some ways. You know, you ask all these questions.
It's more of a Hawaiian shirt these days.
Yeah, we've upgraded to Hawaiian. All these questions, they take you to this different place. You're like, what is this thing? And it's such an interesting hole to go down. Now, what I'd like to try and do is temper that slightly with more of a negative outlook on things and look at it as critically as we can. Like, where are some of the biggest areas of risk, shall we say? So again, Andy, I'll start at this end. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
It's slightly hard to hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, so Pete, so in your view, what would be one of the areas you're most concerned about in terms of the Bitcoin growth and the future of the network?
There's probably a few different ways to take this question. I think I will go with neglect as maybe the first one. Like, I do think there is an aspect of the Bitcoin community where we can see everything as being quite inevitable, and like we actually don't need to do any work. I think that's incorrect. I think we absolutely need to build products. We need to ship things that people are going to use, and we need to solve problems. You don't necessarily need to convince everybody to love Bitcoin. You don't need to convince everybody that the price will go up. I don't think that's the way to do it. But I think that people have problems, and I think that those problems are best solved by solutions that are available to everybody and don't need to ask permission and can be deployed. So I think we should just focus on building solutions to real problems that people have. That, I think, gets us over that problem. But I think there's a risk of neglect and just sitting back and not investing enough into those solutions right now and using them. Like, I think that would be I think that's what kills Bitcoin. If the people aren't there to defend it, then there is no consensus.
And just quickly, just to chime on that neglect phrase. So what do you think creates the neglect? Like, what, just buy some Bitcoin and you can kick back and do nothing? Or where do you think that kind of sentiment comes from?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not neglecting it. I don't like to talk for other people. So it's I guess it's easy to get to a point where I don't know, maybe you feel like you can't contribute to something, or you don't know how. Like, it's just there's certainly like a narrative that everything's inevitable about Bitcoin and it's just going to steamroll the world, and like that's fine and we'll just sit back and do it. Like, I just don't believe in that personally. I think there's a lot of things that we need to solve, and like Bitcoin will solve a lot of these problems if we solve them using Bitcoin as a base layer. So yeah.
Awesome. And so Rusty, to you then. So what are some of the areas that you're most concerned about as this thing grows?
I like the whole complacency thing. More the unknown unknowns. I mean, there are a whole heap of weird technical corner risks. There's, the full-on war on Bitcoin is theoretically possible, right? Nation states decide that they've got to close the exits and it becomes this horrific bloodbath. But it doesn't, to some extent, from a technical perspective, it doesn't matter. If Bitcoin has a value, then it works, right? And if it doesn't have any value, it's just a toy, and once it has value, it works. And the number itself doesn't really matter. I do think that complacency and despair are possible from, if people are in it for the price, then their self-worth is going to correlate with the price, and that's going to suck. Obviously, for me, that's not. I'm just not interested very much in the price. I mean, up is nice, but I went through the dot-com boom where people were looking at their stock price and kind of obsessing over it and not getting any fucking work done, and wasted a year doing it. And I got sucked into that trap too, right? And you just no, it's not healthy. Ignore that. Put it away. Just leave it for your grandchildren or whatever, and just get on with it, right? And I think I think builders and people who are actually doing stuff, rather than people who are just talking about stuff, or who are just sitting back and watching the pretty graphs of going up and down and drawing lines or whatever it is they do with traders. I don't know. I'm not a trader. I think if you got completely overwhelmed by that, it would be possible. Now, I don't think that's likely, because I think there are so many cool things happening, and there are people building and everything else. But I guess my plea would be one of the builders. Be one of the people who are doing cool stuff, not just watching cool stuff.
Well, yeah, I agree with that, 100%. And there's this kind of cool feedback loop as Bitcoin becomes a bigger part of your life and your net wealth, you want to give back. There's this really awesome feedback loop where actually people want to get involved, and much like this event today and everyone that's here, it's such an incredible experience. So yeah, thank you for sharing it with me. Andi, I'll just come to you at the end of that then. So do you have any particular fears or concerns about Bitcoin and where it's going that we should be thinking about?
I think the complacency point is a good point, and I think one area where I want to address the issue of regulation, because I do see that as a potential issue. There are already, for instance, it's very, very challenging to get a banking relationship with kind of traditional banks in the US if you have anything to do with Bitcoin in your company. And that the problems with that became very, very apparent during the banking crisis a couple of months ago, where unfortunately in the current system you do need banking, you need KYC, we need to comply with all of the rules and regulations. And when there's effectively soft ordinances coming down from the government around basically relationships and who can provide technology and banking and any sort of company relationships with anyone to do with crypto, Bitcoin, anything, there's just all of these ways that makes it very, very challenging for Bitcoin businesses to operate. And so even if it's not necessarily saying it's illegal to buy Bitcoin, there's other ways that governments do actually have this ability to hamper and make life very, very difficult. So, for instance, we shouldn't have to think about banking relationships. You shouldn't have to put in place multiple country contingencies to make sure that your company will have on and off ramps and banking relationships. And that's what we're doing. We're like investigating what jurisdictions might work if there are problems with regulation in the US. Like, that is so much effort, brainpower, time. Like, it's just such a waste. So that just gets me obviously a little frustrated, as you will hear. And I do, in the US, and I feel like in Australia, I'm less familiar. I live in the US, so I'm much more familiar with what's going on there. There's just this media war against Bitcoin, which I don't know where it's going, and it does concern me to sort of think about where that's coming from. I'm very confident in Bitcoin. We'll get through it. There are going to be challenges. I think more and more people, I'm just so excited by the growth in the community that I see all around the world. Meetups, conferences popping up everywhere. It's incredible. And I think we need to not be complacent about the fact that there is sort of mainstream narratives coming through. So whether it's the front page, the New York Times article around Bitcoin mining, which is just factually incorrect. There was a New York Times article about the Bitcoin core contributors, which was factually incorrect. The whole Greenpeace campaign, which was factually incorrect. I mean, on that, right, like, so factually incorrect that the artist who created this artwork, after discussing with people like Troy Cross, who's an avid environmentalist, philosophy professor, amazing human being, and then the artist actually did a 180-degree turn and actually said, oh, wow, I didn't understand this. Actually, after discussing with the Bitcoin community, I've been so impressed. You can see it on his Twitter. And actually, I recognize that, my initial response and what Greenpeace's campaign was saying that they paid me to create this artwork for was actually not right. So it's like, I think the narrative is getting through, and I still am. I think we need to be realistic about public perception and regulation. And there's a lot of lobbying efforts happening. There's a lot, that's sort of coalescing in a really positive way in the US, at least. I know there's a Bitcoin initiative here that's happening. I think that's really, really important because we have to be, the downside of Bitcoin is being decentralized is there's no one who is a multi-billionaire off Bitcoin, who's the leader of Bitcoin, who's going and lobbying governments the same way that Sam Bankman-Fried was for crypto, for FTX. So we need to all be part of it. And so I think to your point, that's how you can contribute. You can talk to your local member. You can start having these conversations. We all have to be part of this effort to make Bitcoin a reality. And we all can.
It's funny, the traditional media space, when you start seeing kind of hit pieces like this and looking at it from a different perspective, you wonder, what else have I read that is completely factually incorrect, but I took to be true at the time? Regulation is something that comes up a lot. So just briefly, Rusty, do you have any comments on that from a business perspective as to how you guys look at that? Or Pete, anything that's come up that you'd like to comment on Andy's comments?
No, I'm happy to sit that there.
Pete probably can't hear me. It's all right, mate. I've actually got a better question, so don't
We
that.
generally build products that other people deploy, so we don't really deal with the regulation aspects of that.
Okay, no worries. It wouldn't be a question from me as someone running a Bitcoin podcast about personal journeys that I didn't squeeze one in at the end. So, Rusty, I'll start with you this time. How's Bitcoin changed your life? And we've got a few minutes left, so maybe a minute each if we could just pump through that. And basically everyone in the crowd, these amazing people here have been on incredible journeys, learning about Bitcoin, building Bitcoin, investing in Bitcoin, and, well, it's changing our lives. So I'd love to just hear.
So there's an assumption built into that question that it changed my life. Yeah, okay. I felt I had a unique experience with the whole Linux thing of watching this thing go from fringe weirdness through to mainstream. And that's just, I was in the right place at the right time, right? I'm not particularly smart. I just was there and having fun, and next thing you know, people kept dumping money on my lawn, and they paid me to write stuff, and it was cool, right? And I feel like I've got a second chance at that, right? Because there was this other open source project that was trying to do this weird thing that no one understood. And I was like, oh, okay, I've seen this before. And I literally joined Blockstream after the Mt. Gox crash, right? So Bitcoin was dead, it was all over, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I've heard this story before because, Linux really took off after the .com crash, where right at the end it was all Linux, blah, 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 it was this big thing, and then it just cratered, and it was tumbleweeds, and all those proof of concepts vanished and everything. So I feel like this time, though, I'm like, rather than being the whole, deer in headlights, I'm kind of like, I've seen this before. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it frequently rhymes. And so one thing it's allowed me is to hang out with all these young, enthusiastic people. They've got all this energy, and it's and I'm old now, but it's contagious, right? Because you get to hang out with these people who've got this incredible energy. I think that being involved in a project that's so exciting for so many people, I think has definitely kept me feeling a lot younger than I would have otherwise if I just kind of kept on the same train and had my dash and be done. So yeah, I feel like it's given me like a second lease on life.
Awesome. Thank you, Rusty. And Pete, just to you briefly, we've got a minute each for you and Andy just to quickly rattle off if you can. What's the biggest thing that Bitcoin has changed in your life?
I'd probably say that if I'm really honest, I didn't used to like my job. And on the face of it, it would look like I should have liked that job, but I didn't. And it made me a little bit unhappy. And it's really nice to just get up every day and just to know that I'm working with people that I deeply respect and that I really like, and that I'm working on something that I think is going to have like quite a major impact on the world, and that really motivates me and fills me with hope. So I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. And Andy, just to you to close us out, please.
You said what I was going to say. So it's about hope for me. I think it's, there's so many challenges in the world. It's so easy to get bogged down, but Bitcoin for me is really around it's just so exciting. There's so much hope for the future, and we're building, and you're just kind of wearing it together, and that's really incredible. So it makes me very, very hopeful for the future.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining today. This has been the Building on Bitcoin panel. Thank you.